President Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy, Ukraine, Poland, and 6 other European countries signed an open letter asking the chief executives of prominent social media companies, including Meta, the parent company of Facebook, to take more aggressive steps to halt the spread of false news on their platforms. According to the New York Times, the letter, which was released last Wednesday, asked Meta to take action, quote, against disinformation that undermines our peace and stability, and to eradicate efforts on their platforms to weaken our support to Ukraine amid Russia's war of aggression.
Meta released a statement on Wednesday saying that the company was already taking significant steps against misinformation related to the war in Ukraine, including removing misleading information, quote, likely to cause imminent harm or violence, and using a third-party fact-checking service to determine if posts contain false claims, which are then given lower visibility, the New York Times has reported. Meta said it was also restricting access to RT, Russia's state-financed international cable network, and Sputnik, a Russian government-run news and commentary site, which, according to the New York Times, have disseminated misinformation. Twitter Files author Michael Shellenberger tweeted, "This is totalitarianism." Shellenberger joins us now to weigh in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So walk us through why it is so incredibly dangerous to have private social media companies essentially picking a side in a conflict and then using their power to silence any kind of discussion that doesn't compute with that.
Well, I just think the first thing we have to understand is that here's a case of governments, and this has included the U.S. government, demanding censorship by social media companies. That's a violation of the First Amendment. It's also a violation of the First Amendment for the U.S. government to fund think tanks or academic institutions like the Stanford Internet Observatory to demand censorship by social media companies. But I think what we're seeing here is just creeping totalitarianism. The censorship industrial complex that my colleagues and I, who had access to the Twitter files, have described and documented, and the Facebook files released by the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana also just show a very large network of government-funded organizations demanding and successfully getting censorship by social media companies, including of accurate information, though I hasten to point out that the First Amendment also protects people sharing inaccurate information or opinions. And often we know that information that we think might be inaccurate later turns out to be accurate, or at least a valid kind of hypothesis or speculation.
It's getting to the point where if I read reporting in the mainstream media, or I hear, national security advisors or health advisors, government expert type people warning about misinformation or disinformation, it's just like a red flag. I see a red flag because they're using this term now with such frequency to describe dissenting views, some of which I think are wrong, some of which I think are right. And as you point out, it doesn't matter from the standpoint of the First Amendment. But there's an attempt now by various mainstream forces to describe everything as misinformation, and then there's a kind of implication that it's foreign-based, and it's like invading our country and invading our platforms, and it's a national security issue if we're not taking it more seriously, when really it's just disagreement over what the policy should be. And it's interesting that the side that purports to be caring about democracy, the integrity of democracy, is the one saying we have to limit, the government, et cetera, has to limit your access to more of this different information.
Yes, Robbie, I think you've really hit on an important point here, which is that language is very powerful, and there's something about these words, disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, that is different than saying, differing opinions or different points of view. It suggests that there's some sort of malign actor, there's somebody with bad intentions, maybe terrorists, maybe Russians. And in fact, what we've documented in the Twitter files and what we've seen in the Facebook files are ordinary people often expressing concerns, legitimate concerns, often just describing true vaccine side effects, other people questioning where the coronavirus came from, including the very legitimate question of whether it may have come from a laboratory in Wuhan. Those are all being labeled disinformation and misinformation. So, Robbie, I think you're absolutely correct. I think we need to now, when we hear those words, we need to understand that in most cases, the people using them are making the case for censorship. And that is something that our First Amendment and American culture simply doesn't allow. We allow for a variety of opinions, and we need to protect that because we have seen this kind of creeping totalitarianism.
And what is your view of the approach that Meta has taken with respect to fact-checking? It's interesting how the various companies have tried to handle this. Facebook said, okay, well, we're going to hire these third-party organizations. We're going to try to get an ideological mix. Maybe they said that. They don't have much of an ideological mix. I think they have some token ones on the right. It's mostly a lot of very far-left activist kind of organizations that are going to fact check things, and then they have power to kind of blur the content or have some gatekeeping with content that they don't approve of. I've seen them do this to content that where I think they've unquestionably erred, particularly in the COVID and climate change space. I know these are things you've specialized in, so you've probably seen some of this as well. It would be fine if they were just also producing content, I think, saying, no, this is wrong. That's just how it's supposed to work. You get to have your content saying, I'm wrong. I have my content saying, you're wrong, and let readers decide. But they have the power, which it's not even Meta doing it. Meta deputized them to do this, essentially. I don't think it's working out very well. I much prefer Twitter's kind of community notes function where anyone can fact check anything, and then you can fact check the fact check, and you can fact check the fact check of the fact check. Seems to be working better. What's your view of these things?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there. I mean, I think one of the first important things, Robbie, is that oftentimes the labeling by the social media platforms has been a form of mis or disinformation. So, for example, we saw Twitter labeling the accurate New York Post article about Hunter Biden's laptop as misinformation or suspected information or suspected hack and leak information. That actually served to discredit that information in the minds of many voters. We saw Twitter post a warning on a tweet by a Harvard University professor simply expressing his view that children did not need to be vaccinated. We've seen multiple instances of the social media platforms labeling information in ways that actually spread disinformation. In my case, Facebook censored me through a third-party organization. When they were then sued for it in court, they said, well, it wasn't really a fact check. It was just opinion, the opinion of Facebook. And so on the one hand, you would say, well, that's fine. They have a right to free speech. But then what are my rights enabled to respond to that? Why not just allow the social media platforms in the first place to have debate? If there's different views of these things, why not just have the debate? Why do the social media platforms need to be doing this? I think the immediate answer is transparency. We need to have transparency into what content moderation decisions are being made, how and why they're being made. And we also need transparency into government involvement in requesting those forms of censorship, including labeling.
Right. It's so Orwellian, right? In the name of democracy, we must abandon our First Amendment principle, which is the bedrock of our democracy, right? In the name of protecting Ukraine's democracy, we must censor everything that doesn't comport with our view. Here's my question to you. I mean, is this just a blatant power grab, a way of saying we're no longer going to fight for what we think is right in the court of public opinion? We're simply going to impose it by silencing everybody who disagrees? Or do you think that the people doing this truly believe in what they're saying? And in that case, how do we get them to see what we can so easily see, which is that your democracy is the work of hearing the side you disagree with, and nothing you create by getting rid of that is going to be worthy of being called a democracy?
Yeah, well, I think exactly what you said, Bot. Yeah, I mean, I think you know that part of the history here is this is a reaction by media and cultural elites to the rise of social media in general, and in particular to the election of Trump in 2016. That resulted in what I think can be described as an elite panic and a desire by the intelligence community and their affiliated and funded think tanks to basically demand that social media start censoring disfavored voices. It's not just the censorship, though. It's also, we saw many disinformation campaigns. One of the most famous has been the mislabeling of Trump supporters as Russian bots, done in something called Hamilton 68. So I think the people demanding the censorship, who I've studied pretty carefully, are true believers. They're just very dogmatic. I think many of them are basically snobs. I think, sorry to use the word, but I think that's the most accurate word for describing people who just think they're better than ordinary people. They know what's best for people. I mean, you can see it when they're saying you should censor, which has happened both on Twitter and Facebook. You should censor people sharing stories about vaccine side effects, because we wouldn't want people to get the wrong idea, like not getting the vaccine. That's paternalism, that's elitism, and to the extent that the U.S. government was involved, it's plainly a violation of the First Amendment.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for joining us.